I only meant to fix the neighbor's gate before it got completely dark, but the moment the orc girl appeared at the end of the stone path, I realized I had stepped into something much bigger than a simple act of kindness from next door. My life was quiet and small. 28 years old single, and living alone in a rented house on the eastern edge of Eldermere. I earned my keep as a carpenter and handyman building horse stalls, patching roofs, replacing hinges, mending trapdoors, putting up fences, and I was never starving, but I was never comfortable either. Every coin came from the work of my own calloused hands, and I had a stubborn kind of pride that made me hate asking anyone for anything. No family shared the house with me. No one waited for me at supper. The place was so small that a single draft slipping through the cracks in the door was enough to remind me how alone I really was. The house right beside mine was different, wider set behind a low stone wall and a neat garden. Its iron gate was handsome but old. The owner was an orc woman named Savra. I didn't know much about her. She rarely came out when the rest of the neighborhood gathered. I had only ever caught glimpses of dark cloaks sweeping across the yard, a closed carriage arriving and leaving servants carrying crates of books, potted plants, and bundles of papers. She lived quietly, keeping a distance that felt deliberate, like an invisible line drawn around her that no one was invited to cross. Then came the strong wind at the end of the week. The iron gate sagged badly, one wooden post cracked at the base, the hinges drooping, the crossbar scraping against the stone flags. For 3 days I watched it lean a little more each morning. No one came to repair it, no workmen arrived. I knew that kind of damage. It looked small now, but left alone it would pull the whole post down within a days. I spent half an afternoon hesitating. I wasn't rich. Good timber cost money I could barely spare. Still, I ended up counting out what little silver I had and buying a new post, a handful of forged nails, fresh iron pins, and a sack of mortar to reset the base. The reason was simple. I could not stand to walk past something broken when I knew exactly how to fix it. That afternoon the sun slanted hard and hot. I assumed Severa was away. Her carriage had left at dawn, so I stripped off my outer shirt, rolled up my sleeves, and set to work. The job was heavier than I expected. The earth around the old post had packed solid as stone, the buried wood was rotten inside, and the hinges were twisted from years of neglect. Sweat ran into my eyes, dust clung to my neck and wrists, but the work felt good. Some days it is easier to mend a gate than to sit inside an empty house and mend nothing at all. I was crouched down, hammering fresh stone into place beneath the new post when a shadow fell across the ground. I looked up. She stood only a few paces away. Severa. She wore no fine, noble gown, only a plain, dark linen dress with the sleeves rolled high and her black hair tied low at the nape of her neck. Yet everything about her carried the quiet weight of someone used to being obeyed. The straight line of her shoulders, the calm, almost cold steadiness in her yellow eyes, the way she stood as though the world had never required her to explain herself. What surprised me most was that she did not look angry. She simply studied the gate, then my hands, and asked in a low, even voice, "Are you repairing my gate?" I stood quickly wiping my palms on my trousers, suddenly feeling like a fool caught trespassing. "I saw it was about to fall," I said. Seemed easier to fix it than watch it collapse. The answer sounded clumsy even to me. There was nothing easy about hours of sweat and dust and heavy timber under a burning sun. But I had no better words. I did not want to sound like I was asking for thanks or payment. She watched me for a long moment. Then she pulled off her gloves, glanced at the fresh post, and said quietly, "No one has done anything like this for me in a long time." Her voice stayed level, but something thin and honest ran beneath it. Before I could reply, she added a single word. "Thank you." That simple thank you knocked every guess I had made out of place. I had braced myself for suspicion, irritation, or at least the cool politeness of someone far above my station. Instead, she thanked me as though the broken gate mattered more to her than any outsider could understand. Just before she turned back toward the house, she paused and said, "You are Cale Rowan, aren't you?" I froze. I had never told her my name. She knew it the way someone knows a fact they have already looked into, not by chance, by choice. And in that same instant, seeing how her servant opened the side gate from a distance without a single question, I understood something important. The orc woman who lived so quietly beside me was not merely a wealthier neighbor. She was someone with position, with power, and she had already taken the trouble to learn exactly who I was. The next morning, I was lacing my boots ready to head to the timber yard for the day's work when a firm knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find a servant in dark, neatly pressed livery holding a wooden tray. On it lay warm bread, a small jar of apple honey sliced cured meat, and a modest leather pouch heavy with coins. Tue to Sèvres sends her thanks for the gate, the man said politely. I refused the pouch at once. Not out of pride alone, I simply had not fixed the gate, expecting payment the very next day. The servant only smiled as though he had been warned this would happen and set the tray down. Then he placed a second sheet of paper beside it. It was a receipt. Sèvres had already paid the timber merchant for every nail post and sack of mortar I had bought, plus the small roof repair I still owed from the month before. The note carried her neat signature and the seal of House Thornmere. I stood there staring at the paper long after the servant had gone. When I reached the timber yard later that afternoon to buy more nails, the old merchant raised an eyebrow at me. "Ah, so you're the carpenter working for House Thornmere now." "I'm not working for anyone," I answered. He chuckled. "If Lady Sèvres has already settled your accounts and sent a guarantee in your name, then half the merchants in the eastern quarter will look at you differently from today onward." Only then did the name finally sink in. Thornmere. The family that owned nearly a third of the warehouses along the river controlled the largest grain stores and held the deeds to half the shops in the merchant district. Sèvres was not simply a wealthy neighbor. She was one of the most powerful women in Eldermere, and I had spent yesterday afternoon sweating and hammering on her property without the slightest idea who she was. That same evening, just after sunset, another knock came lighter this time. I opened the door and found Sèvres herself standing on my threshold holding a small basket of fresh bread. No carriage waited behind her. No guards. Just her in the same plain, dark dress hair still tied low. "May I come in?" she asked. The question stunned me more than learning her family name. A woman of her station did not need permission to enter a rented shack like mine. I stepped aside. When she crossed the threshold, the little room suddenly felt even smaller, the low ceiling closer, the single chair ridiculous. We sat at my rough table. Sèvres set the basket between us and for a moment said nothing. Then she spoke plainly, without ceremony. "Most of the houses on this street belong to Thornmere in one way or another. I make it my business to know the names of those who live beside me, not to watch them, but because I dislike living next to shadows with no names." She told me she had noticed me long before the gate broke, watching me repair my own leaking roof, helping the old widow at the end of the lane when her cartwheel snapped, and never raising my voice in anger, even when other men would have. The fact that I had fixed her gate without being asked, without expecting anything in return, had caught her off guard. For the first time, I saw beneath the composed mask she wore in public. Her shoulders carried a quiet tension. The shadows under her eyes were faint, but real. She held her cup of tea as though the warmth itself was something to cling to. She admitted the gate had been a gift from her father before he died. After his passing, no one in the great house had bothered to notice it slowly tilting. There were dozens of servants, yet no one truly saw the small things falling apart. That quiet confession told me more than any title could. Sèvres Thornmere was surrounded by people who wanted her signature, her favor, or her gold, but very few who simply saw what needed mending and mended it. Before she left, she paused at the door and said, "There is an old warehouse at the eastern docks belonging to my family. It has been neglected for too long. I would like you to look at it tomorrow, not as a hired laborer, but as someone whose eyes and hands I trust." I could have refused. The smart part of me knew that stepping further into her world meant stepping into debts I might never repay. Yet when she spoke the word trust, something in me answered before my caution could catch up. I agreed to come the following morning. As she stepped outside, she stopped once more, one hand resting on the gate I had repaired. "You fixed this as though the place already felt like yours," I answered, half honestly, half to dodge the weight of what she was really saying. "I just hate seeing anything on the verge of breaking." She looked at me for a long moment, the lantern light catching the faint emerald of her skin and the steady gold of her eyes. "Then you may end up hating quite a few things in my world. With that, she walked back into the night, leaving me standing on my own crooked doorstep with the taste of fresh bread still on my tongue, and the sudden uneasy knowledge that a single mended gate had opened a door I could no longer close. The next morning I met Severa at the eastern docks, as agreed. The warehouse belonging to House Thornmere was larger than I expected, long stone built, with heavy timber beams and a slate roof that had seen better decades. But the closer we walked, the clearer the neglect became. Damp had crept into the lower beams, the floorboards rose and dipped like waves, the main doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the foundations near the river channel showed signs of erosion. It was the kind of slow rot that looked accidental until you looked twice. Severa walked beside me without servants or guards, her plain cloak drawn close against the river wind. She said nothing, while I inspected the place, only watched my hands as I ran them over the beams and tested the floor with my boot. After 20 minutes, I straightened and told her the truth. If this isn't reinforced within a month, the first heavy rain will crack half the floor and bring the east wall down with it. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded once and said, "I thought as much." The more I looked, the less the damage felt like ordinary neglect. Bolts had been removed and replaced with ones that didn't match the thread. Good oak planks had been swapped for cheaper, weaker pine that was already splitting. The supply ledger claimed full stocks, yet the actual shelves were short by nearly a third. These weren't mistakes. Someone inside was deliberately bleeding the place dry, slowly enough that it could be blamed on time and weather. I said so aloud. Severa's jaw tightened, but she didn't look surprised. "I suspected the same," she answered quietly. But suspicion is not proof. While I was measuring a cracked support beam, footsteps approached from the back office. A man in a well-cut tunic stepped into the light Varin, the warehouse steward. He smiled at Severa with practiced deference, bowing just enough to show respect without groveling. When his eyes slid to me, the smile thinned. "My lady," he said smoothly, "the warehouse has simply suffered from the recent storms. No need for outside carpenters. Hiring strangers only wastes coin. A normal steward would have welcomed any extra pair of hands that might save his master's property." Varin sounded like a man protecting something. Severa's voice stayed even. "Cale is here at my request. He will give me an honest assessment." Varin's gaze flicked to me again, colder now, before he bowed once more and retreated. On the walk back from the docks, Severa spoke more openly. Her father had died 2 years earlier. Since then, she had held the family's power, but many of the old managers remained loyal to her uncle Lorcan and his faction. They smiled to her face and undermined her behind her back, skimming coin, delaying shipments, weakening assets so they could later blame her poor leadership and force her to hand over control. The broken gate had been only the first thing she noticed falling apart. There were dozens more small cracks spreading through everything she had inherited. 2 days later, the threats reached me. The nails I had ordered for the warehouse repair were swapped for inferior ones that snapped under light pressure. One of my drawings for the reinforcement vanished from the site. That same evening, a drunk at the tavern near my house muttered, loudly enough for me to hear, "Sleeping next to Thornmere's wall doesn't make you part of the house, carpenter. Some walls fall on the people who lean against them." I knew the pattern. Small warnings first, then bigger ones if I didn't back away. I told Severa the next time we met. She studied me for a long moment, the golden light of the lantern catching the faint scars on her green knuckles. "If you wish to step away now," she said, "I will not hold it against you." The offer was genuine. That honesty made it impossible for me to accept. "If I leave now," I answered, "they'll know this way always works. Besides, I don't like watching a swarm of woodworms eat someone's house from the inside while she stands there alone." For the first time in days, her eyes softened, not the look of a lady pleased to have gained another loyal servant, but the look of a woman who had finally heard someone speak to her without calculating the cost. We decided not to confront Varin yet. Instead, we prepared a false supply list for a major repair expensive rare timber, special forged nails, and a large advance payment for transport. The list would travel through the normal channels. Whoever was skimming would have to show their hand. Severa let me stamp the duplicate copy myself. "You are the first person I have trusted with something like this," she said without feeling I am handing them a blade to put against my throat. That night I returned home late. The gate I had repaired stood straight and solid under the moonlight, but its straightness only made the invisible cracks around Sèvres seem wider and deeper. I sat on my doorstep listening to the distant river and wondering how a single afternoon of fixing someone else's gate had pulled me into a quiet war over power and coin. Tomorrow we would see whether Varn took the bait. If he did, we would have proof. If he didn't, I would learn exactly how large the nest I had poked truly was. Only one day after we planted the false supply list, the first signs appeared. A portion of the expensive timber listed on the fake ledger vanished from the warehouse inventory before any wagon had even been loaded. The numbers in the internal record no longer matched the physical count. Someone had opened the books, taken what they thought was real cargo, and prepared to move the profit before the repairs could begin. Sèvres read the report without raising her voice. Her face stayed calm, almost cold, but I saw the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. She had lived with betrayal long enough to recognize its smell. We followed the trail that same night. A young porter who still had a conscience whispered that Varn planned to meet one of Lorcan Thornmere's men at the old warehouse after dark to hand over the real ledgers and split the skimmed coin. Sèvres wanted to bring armed guards and arrest them immediately. I stopped her. If we move too soon, they'll deny everything. We need them holding something dirty in their hands. In the end, only 4 of us went, Sèvres, myself, and 2 of her most trusted silent guards. We crouched in the shadows near the river dock while the night wind carried the smell of cold water and wet stone. The warehouse loomed dark and silent, the same building I had inspected only days earlier. Now it felt like a trap, waiting to spring. Varn arrived, first lantern low. A second man followed broad-shouldered, wearing the discreet crest of Lorcan's faction. They slipped inside through a side door. We waited, then moved closer, staying in the blind spots I had mapped during my earlier visit. Inside, their voices carried clearly. Varn opened a chest and began transferring papers. The false materials will be logged as part of the real repair. When the warehouse suffers an accident next week, the losses will be blamed on Lady Sèvres' mismanagement. She'll be forced to surrender partial control of the Eastern Holdings. Lorcan has already prepared the documents. The other man laughed softly. She still thinks she can run the family alone. Pathetic. Sèvres' body went rigid beside me. I felt her hand brush my arm, trembling with the effort of staying still. We were about to step forward when a third figure appeared at the far end of the warehouse. He carried a small clay pot and a length of oil-soaked rope. Before any of us could shout, he smashed the pot against a stack of old timber and dropped a burning brand. Flames exploded upward with terrifying speed. The oil-soaked wood caught like kindling. Smoke billowed thick and black. In seconds, the entire eastern corner of the warehouse was roaring. Chaos erupted. Varenne and the other man bolted for the door. Our guards moved to cut them off. Shouts and the clash of steel rang out. But the fire was faster. It raced along the beams I had marked as weakest only days ago, eating the rotten wood I had warned Sèvres about. My carpenter's instinct took over before fear could catch up. I knew exactly where the real ledgers were stored, on the heavy oak table in the rear office, the one place still untouched by the flames. If those papers burned, everything we had risked tonight would turn to ash. I ran straight into the burning warehouse. Behind me, Sèvres screamed my name. I didn't stop. Inside heat slammed against my face like a furnace door opening. Smoke clawed at my throat. Beams groaned overhead. I kicked aside a burning crate, lunged across the room, and snatched the iron-bound chest of ledgers from the table. The metal was already hot enough to blister my palms. I turned to run back. His support beam directly above the doorway cracked with a sound like a breaking bone. It fell. I threw myself sideways, but the end of the beam caught my shoulder and the back of my leg, driving me to the floor. Pain flared white-hot. Smoke filled my lungs. The chest of papers felt heavier than the whole world. Then strong hands grabbed the back of my shirt and yanked with brutal force. Sèvres! She had charged straight into the flames after me. Her cloak was already smoldering. Her eyes were wide and furious and terrified all at once. She dragged me backward, boots scraping across the burning floorboards until we spilled out the side door and collapsed onto the cold, wet dock stones. I lay there coughing, clutching the chest to my chest like a dying man. Sèvres knelt over me, one hand pressed to the burn on my shoulder, the other checking the gash on my leg. Her own palms were raw and blistered from pulling burning wood aside to reach me. "You idiot," she rasped, voice hoarse from smoke. You absolute stubborn fool. I managed a weak grin through the coughing, but I got the ledgers. For a heartbeat, she stared at the chest, then at me. Something in her face broke open raw fear, the kind she never let anyone see. Not fear of losing the warehouse. Fear of losing me. Our guards had already subdued Varen and the other man. The ledgers combined with the confessions we had overheard and the arson attempt caught in the act were more than enough. By dawn, Varen was in chains. The second man confessed quickly once he realized Lorcan would not protect him. The paper trail led straight back to Savra's uncle. The evidence was undeniable. When the last guard dragged Varun away, only Sevra and I remained on the dock. Thin rain mixed with falling ash drifted down around us. The warehouse fire had been beaten back, but half the building still glowed red in the darkness. Sevra reached out and touched the raw burn on my shoulder with careful fingers. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why did you run back in?" I could have said it was for the papers, for proof, for justice. But the smoke and the pain and the way she had dragged me out of the fire had burned away every careful word I still possessed. Because I didn't want to watch your world burn down in front of me. We stood there in the falling ash and rain, the ruined warehouse smoldering behind us. Between us, something had finally caught fire that no amount of water or denial could put out. 2 days after the warehouse fire, the Thornmere family council met behind closed doors. The evidence from the ledgers Varen's confession and the arson attempt left no room for denial. Lorcan Thornmere was not dragged through the public square or hanged in the square. The family preferred silence and shame. He was stripped of every key position cut off from the eastern trade routes and ordered to leave the main estate by nightfall. No public announcement was made, but within hours, the entire merchant quarter knew. Savra kept her power. The web of quiet sabotage that had slowly eaten at her inheritance was torn apart at the roots. For the first time since her father's death, the people around her understood that she was not an easy target to be worn down. I returned home late that evening, bone-tired and still smelling of smoke. The gate I had repaired stood straight and solid under the lantern light. For the first time, I saw it differently. It was no longer just a gate. It was the first small thing in her world that someone had chosen to mend without being asked, without expecting reward. If that gate could be saved, perhaps other broken pieces could be saved too. Sevra came to my door that night without carriage or guards. She wore the same plain, dark dress hair tied simply face still, carrying the faint shadows of exhaustion and smoke. She no longer looked like the lady of House Thornmere standing at the edge of my world. She looked like a woman who had walked across the street because she wanted to, not because duty required it. She stepped through the gate I had fixed and rested her hand on the new post exactly where I had hammered the last nail. A small smile touched her lips. "It still stands well." I answered. Anything fixed the right way usually does. The words carried more weight than either of us admitted. We were no longer talking only about wood and iron. We sat at my small table again. This time, Sevra did not hide behind titles or distance. She spoke quietly, honestly. After my father died, many people came to my side with gifts, promises, and carefully worded offers. None of them ever did anything as simple and silent as fixing a broken gate without being asked. No one ever looked at something falling apart and simply decided to mend it because it needed mending. That is why I trusted you. Not because you were the strongest or the cleverest, but because you saw what was broken and chose to fix it before anyone told you to. Her voice softened further. You gave me back something I had forgotten existed, simple kindness with no price attached. I looked down at my hands still bearing fresh burns and blisters from the fire. The words I had been holding inside for days finally rose to the surface. At first, I only meant to do one decent thing and walk away. Then I stayed, because I was angry at the worms eating away at your house while you stood there alone. But in the end, I stayed because I did not want to leave your world anymore. The confession left my throat dry. I was not a man used to pretty speeches. I only knew how to speak plainly once the careful lies had burned away. Sevra was silent for a long time. Then she stood, walked around the table, and stopped so close that I could smell river water and wood smoke still clinging to her cloak. She reached out and placed a small ring of keys in my palm keys to the side gate, the tool house, and the private door of the main residence. "If you want," she said, voice low, "next time you will not have to wait for me to come home before you step inside." To me, those keys meant more than any contract or title. They were an invitation to cross the last invisible line between neighbor and something far deeper. I looked up at her. "Are you certain Sevra met my eyes without hesitation?" "If I were not certain, I would never have handed you those keys." I lifted my hand and touched her cheek with the same care I had used when hammering the final nail into her gate. She did not pull away. I leaned in slowly and kissed her. It was not the hurried kiss of victory or relief. It was the kiss of two people who had walked through suspicion, betrayal, fire, and a broken gate, and had finally arrived on the other side, standing face to face as themselves. Everything had begun because I could not walk past a neighbor's gate that was about to fall and do nothing. At that moment, I had no idea the orc woman who lived behind it held power over half the city. I did not know she was surrounded by people waiting for her to stumble. And I certainly did not know that one quiet, unpaid act of fixing something small would become the first honest thing she had received in years. In the end, I had not only repaired a hinge, a post, or a gate, I had stepped through that gate and helped hold together the life that was quietly cracking apart behind it. And perhaps the strangest lesson this stubborn carpenter ever learned is this: sometimes people do not walk into love with flowers or grand declarations. They walk in with a hammer, a few nails, and enough honest kindness to fix what no one else bothered to see was broken.